So what did you miss at Jubilee today? Well, you missed the Labor Day weekend. You missed a long weekend where, again, a lot of people in church today, and good music provided by our friend Wayne, who was stepping in for Daniel. Anne was back today off maternity leave, not leading, but in the congregation and showing off baby Eleanor, and that's always that's always worth the time. In fact, we didn't even have to have a service. We could have just come, listened to the music, and adored Eleanor, and it would have been enough. But we did some more than that. We heard a challenging gospel, and we began the story of Moses. Now, I say began the story. In Exodus, we started with the story of the burning bush and the voice of God telling Moses to go back to Egypt. And I say that's where we started Moses' story. Now we all know there is more to Moses' story. There's the baby floating in the basket. There's being raised as a prince in Egypt. There is the discovering the torment of his people and his anger, frustration, lashing out and killing a soldier, a guard, and fleeing. There's all of that story. But somehow it seems as if we're starting the story today because Moses was once a prince, and now he's the shepherd of his father-in-law's flock. Kind of a fall from grace. He is not what he once was. And I think for many of us, as we come down from the peak of our careers or our fitness or our health or our life or whatever it is, as we surpass that apex and we're coming down, we start to think that our story is over. It's been written, it's done. We don't really have much more to contribute after all. Now we're not important anymore, or we're retired, or we're old, whatever it is. And I find it fascinating that really this is when Moses' story really starts. It's when he's tending the flock of his father-in-law that God speaks to him. God speaks to him and essentially says to him, I want you to go back to that place where you were once a prince. I want you to go back to that place where you're wanted for murder. I want you to go back to that place as a shepherd, as a filthy, dirty, working man. And I want you to go to Pharaoh and tell him to release his labor force, to stop the genocide, and to let the people go. You can do that. So the story is a bit of a reach. Not just because the task is so impossible, but because you don't ask people on the downside of their careers to do big and important things. At least we don't usually. And by the way, it's not often that God shows up at work. That's what Moses is doing, right? God shows up at holy times, at Christmas, at Easter, at church services, when we're in our Sunday best and we're praying really hard and we're pious and we're doing good works. That's when we hear the voice of God. We hear the voice of God tell us, well done, you. We don't expect to hear the voice of God when we're at work, just doing our normal stuff. And yet here in the story, it's exactly what happens. And when Moses asks for support, asks how he can possibly do all of this, God says to him, I am that I am, and I will be with you. And I will be with you is enough. Enough for this man who is past his career peak. This man who has fled a fugitive. This man who was once great and revered and now is no longer privileged, no longer great, but a simple laborer. More than enough for him to go back and face his past and face the Pharaoh. More than enough for him to do what seems to be impossible. And so the consideration for all of us is how God speaks to us in the mundane, in our regular lives, not in our holy moments. And how God often asks us to do those things that are so, well, it seems impossible. And the only promise that we get is I'll be with you. But that promise is enough. All we have to do is respond like Moses did and say, here I am, all of me, ready to try. That's what we engaged with today at Jubilee. That's what you missed, but you don't have to miss it. You can look for God this week. You may not get a burning bush, but you'd be surprised at how often the divine speaks to us in the mundane and the regular. How often God asks us to do things that we're not so sure we can do. But when we dare to stumble forward, we discover that we're not alone and that we can do remarkable things. I hope you discover that this week. I also hope you get back to see us soon because we miss you. And it really is better when you're here. Until we see you again, God bless.